So, welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we sit down to start these sessions, we are looking at, I don't know, a specific breakthrough in tech.
Right, or maybe a shift in the geopolitical landscape or something.
Yeah, exactly. But today we are stepping onto an actual battle. And I really don't use that word lightly here.
No, you really don't.
There is a digital civil war currently raging across the internet right now. You look in the comment sections or the video essays or on Twitter, sorry X, and it is just vicious out.
It is entirely unhinged.
But the strange thing for you listening is that they aren't fighting over a jagged border in Eastern Europe or some new tax policy.
No, they're fighting over a movie.
Oh?
And not just any movie, but a brand new adaptation of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights.
Right.
It's directed by Emerald Fennell, and it stars Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi. And honestly, to say it has divided opinion would be the understatement of the century.
Oh, absolutely.
It has effectively fractured the internet into two violently opposing reality points.
Yeah, I've been reading through the source material you sent over, started specifically this massive breakdown of the fallout by the commentator Dispart. And fractured really is the perfect word for it.
It really is.
Because on one side, you have people acting like this film is the second coming of cinematic greatness because it's a quote-unquote vibe.
Right, the aesthetic side.
Yeah, and then on the other side, you have people literally describing it as a crime against art, like a travesty, and evidence that Western civilization is collapsing in real time.
I mean, it's hyperbolic, yes, but the intensity of that reaction is exactly what we're here to study today. Because this isn't just a movie review deep dive.
Right, we're not doing a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of thing.
No, we aren't going to spend an hour debating whether the lighting was good or the pacing worked. We are going to perform an autopsy on the culture that produced this massive reaction.
Exactly.
Because the source material argues that this backlash is actually about something much bigger than Margot Robbie's wig.
Much bigger.
It's about a literacy crisis. It's about the very purpose of art and the terrifying possibility that we have actually forgotten how to watch movies.
Which is a heavy payload for a story about two miserable people on the Yorkshire moors.
It really is.
But I mean, let's get into the gossip of the fallout first, because the descriptions of these two camps are honestly just hilarious.
They are pretty wild.
So let's start with Camp A. Who are these people?
So Camp A is what the source material identifies as the audience for, quote, slop.
Slop.
Yeah. These are the viewers who find the film, to quote the reviews, hot and sexy and a smooth-brained delight.
Smooth-brained delight.
Yeah. They are approaching this movie purely as a sensory experience. They aren't looking for narrative coherence or fidelity to the Bronte text. They're just looking for stimulation.
It's funny because smooth-brained is usually an insult, right? But here it seems to be reclaimed as almost a lifestyle choice. Like, just turn your brain off and look at the pretty people on screen.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you have Camp B. And these are the people for whom this movie is essentially a personal insult.
Right. They take it very seriously.
Extremely. They view it as hauntingly vapid. They see it as a complete travesty. For them, the mere existence of this movie is proof that we have stopped caring about quality and are just cheerfully feeding the lowest common denominator.
And the source material makes a really interesting point about the middle ground here. Or well, rather, the lack of one.
Yeah, it's described as a no man's land. The source argues that usually with a mediocre movie, you'd have a middle group.
Yeah.
People saying, you know, the script was weak, but the cinematography was nice.
Sure, normal movie criticism.
Right. But here, that middle ground is just empty. The source says the only people standing there are a few film nerd men talking about lens choice, and everyone else is completely polarized.
You're either fully in or fully out.
Exactly. You either actively want the slop or you are completely horrified by it.
So let's unpack why. What is it about this specific movie that is triggering such a visceral, almost physical reaction? Because looking at your notes, it starts with the actual texture of the film.
Yes.
And I mean that literally. The physical texture on screen.
Right. We are talking about the moist critique.
The moist critique. I genuinely thought this was a joke at first when I was reading it, but it's everywhere in the reviews. The film is described constantly as incredibly moist and sticky and just filled with goo and ooze.
Is the defining aesthetic of Fennell's vision here. And the source material highlights that both the lovers and the haters of the film are entirely fixated on how wet this movie.
They just disagree on if that's a good thing.
Precisely. Camp A sees it as earthy and sensual and raw. And Camp B sees it as honestly just disgusting.
The list of fluids mentioned in the source is extensive too. They talk about snail goo and sweat and leeches. There's a mention of rain that literally never dries.
Yes.
It feels like the director is actively trying to replace dialogue with dampness.
That is exactly the critique being leveled. The argument is that when you don't trust your audience to understand complex emotional tension, the kind that Bronte actually wrote, which is heavily internal and psychological inquiries, you have to externalize it.
You have to make it super obvious.
You have to make it visual. So instead of a scene where Kathy is struggling internally with her class consciousness and her lift cliff, you get a scene of, well, do you recall the dough scene from the notes?
The very wet dough, yeah. The source describes this bizarre scene where sexual tension is supposedly represented by someone kneading incredibly wet, sticky dough, while Kathy just loses her mind watching it.
Right. It's a visual metaphor that is basically screaming in your face. Look at this. It is sticky, just like they're forbidden. It's tactile, sure. But the source argues it's also incredibly crude. It's replacing complex literary subtext with literal slime.
And then, of course, we have to talk about the goose.
Oh, the goose.
I laughed out loud reading this part of the source. One of the reviews, which was ostensibly a positive review, by the way, described a goose in the film as the sex.
I know. Just stops you right in your tracks, doesn't it? The sexiest goose.
What does that even mean in the context of a farm animal? Is the goose posing for the camera? Is it giving a smoldering look?
I think it really highlights the absurdity that the critics in Camp B are pointing out. When your entire filmmaking philosophy just vibes and hot, you eventually end up sexualizing farm animals because you fundamentally don't know when to stop.
You just apply the filter to everything.
Right. The camera's lingering on everything with this corno-chic aesthetic, so eventually even the livestock gets the sexy treatment.
It sounds like a parody of a movie.
It feels like one to a lot of people. But for that smooth brain audience, it absolutely works. It creates an atmosphere where everything is heightened and sensual, even if it makes literally zero narrative sense.
Which brings us back to that term again, smooth brain. The source material is pretty savage about the target audience here. It's not just saying these are people who happen to like bad movies. It's implying an actual cognitive deficit.
Oh, the quotes in the source are brutal.
Yeah.
Things like, did you take a stupid pill with your breakfast? Or this movie is made for idiots.
Yikes.
The underlying argument isn't just that the audience has bad taste, it's that the movie is specifically designed for base impulse. It is mathematically designed to bypass the frontal lobe, the part of your brain that handles logic and history and complex morality, and go straight to the lizard.
Because the lizard brain just wants pretty colors and loud noises.
And sexy geese, apparently.
Right.
The source argues that the movie is marketing itself directly to people who explicitly want to turn off their brain. We hear that phrase a lot in modern pop culture, I just want to turn my brain off.
Yeah, it's a very common defense of blockbusters.
And this movie is the ultimate product for that exact mindset.
There is also this really funny mix-up in the internet discourse mentioned regarding the female, or rather the word gaze.
Oh, yes, the gays versus gays confusion.
Yeah.
It's honestly a perfect snapshot of modern internet discourse.
It really is.
So you have film critics analyzing the female gaze, or specifically what they are calling the Disney villain gaze, which is this very specific, stylized, heavy-lidded look that's super popular on TikTok right now.
Like the bedroom eyes filter everyone uses.
Exactly that. But then you have people mishearing the word gays as gay, J-Y-S.
Right.
Which leads to these massive online arguments about whether the LGBTQ community is being targeted or represented by the film, when really everyone in the original thread was just talking about an eye-roll aesthetic.
That is just chaos.
It is chaos.
Yeah.
But it underscores the point that the conversation around this film isn't deep or analytical. It's entirely reactive. It's just about buzzwords and confusion.
Okay, so we've firmly established that the movie is a wet, sticky, smooth-brained sensory over. But if this were just some random Netflix rom-com called, The Yorkshire Affair, maybe people would just roll their eyes and move on.
Probably.
But it's not. It's Wuthering Heights. It's a cornerstone of English literature. And that seems to be the core reason why the backlash is so unusually violent.
Precisely. You are touching on what the source calls the fancification of the classic.
Right.
The source argues that Fennell hasn't actually adapted the book at all. She has skinned it.
Skinned it?
Yeah, she has taken the character names and the general Moors setting, and she has worn them like a suit. But the actual body underneath is complete.
They compare it directly to 50 Shades of Grey they call it 50 Shades of Grim.
Which is a incredibly scathing indictment if you think about it.
Yeah.
Because 50 Shades famously started as Twilight fanfic. It is, by its very definition, derivative and simplified. So by comparing this Wuthering Heights to 50 Shades, the source is basically saying you have taken a complex literary masterpiece about generational trauma and class warfare and the brutal cycle of abuse, and you have just turned it into a winking bodice.
A toxic romance for teens.
Exactly. The source points out that Wuthering Heights isn't supposed to be hot in a modern, sexy way. It's supposed to be genuinely terrifying. It's about two deeply damaged people who absolutely destroy everyone around.
But this movie wants to be a music video.
Exactly.
There is a specific scene the source describes to highlight this, the opening scene, which they call a bait and switch. Can you walk us through what happens there?
It is the perfect encapsulation of the film's dishonesty, according to the source. So the movie opens with a completely black screen, and you hear this sound, this really guttural, deep moaning.
So the audience, which has been primed for 50 Shades of Grim, is sitting there thinking, all right, here we go, the sex.
Exactly. You are entirely supposed to think it's a sex scene. The source says the director is heavily counting on you, assuming it's sex.
Right.
But then the visual fades in, and it's revealed to actually be a man seconds from death just groaning in absolute agony.
So it's just a massive gotcha moment.
It's a cheap trick.
Yeah.
And the source argues it symbolizes the whole ethos of the film. It promises you something deep or intense, but it's constantly just playing these juvenile games with your expectations. It's constantly prioritizing the initial shock or the aesthetic over the actual reality of the narrative moment.
Which brings us to the people playing. Margot Robbie as Kath, Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff. I mean, on paper, that sounds like a Hollywood box office dream team. You've got Barbie meeting Euphoria.
Right.
But the source absolutely
hates is honestly putting it mildly. Let's start with Margot Robbie. The critique here is partly about her styling and partly about her overall performance.
Right.
The source mentions a specific hairstyle she wears throughout the film and claims that Variety magazine even referred to them as minge braid.
I saw that in the notes. That is an incredibly vivid and weird description. It implies a certain unkempt, messy, almost pubic quality to the hair on her head.
Yes. It implies that the styling is intentionally ugly or supposedly edgy in a way that just ends up looking terrible. But going beyond the braid, the deeper argument is that Robbie is entirely miscast because she is just too polished.
She looks too modern.
She's a modern movie star.
Yeah.
Kathy, in the book, is supposed to be wild. She's deeply connected to the harshness of the moors, almost feral in a way.
Yeah.
The source implies Robbie is just placed there to be wallpaper. She's there to look distressed in a highly beautiful, highly marketable way.
And then you have Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff. And this is where the critique really gets into the actual subs, because Heathcliff isn't just a generic bad boy trope.
Not at all.
Yeah.
In Bronte's novel, Heathcliff is explicitly described as dark. He's often interpreted by scholars as Romani or mixed race. He is a total outsider in every possible. He is found starving on the streets of Liverpool. Yeah. He is subjected to constant racial abuse. He's treated as entirely subhuman by the upper class of the area.
And that matters.
It matters massively.
Yeah.
That racism and that class oppression is the entire engine of the plot. It is exactly why he becomes so cruel. It is the core reason he seeks such total revenge on everyone.
And Jacob Elordi is, well, he's a very tall, very handsome, very white Australian man.
He's a gym bro, to quote the source directly. By casting a conventional white heartthrob, you instantly remove the entire racial subtext of the novel. You remove the systemic oppression that defines his life.
Right.
And what are you left with when you do that?
Yeah.
You are just left with a rich white guy who is inexplicably a massive jerk to his girlfriend.
It just completely flattens the character into nothing.
It lobotomizes the character. The source argues that without that crucial racial and class element, Heathcliff isn't a tragic figure warped by a cruel society. He's just an abuser. And that leads us to this fascinating conservative message that is supposedly hidden inside this edgy film.
Yeah, this was a twist I really didn't see coming when I was reading the prep, because Emerald Fennell is usually seen as this highly progressive, transgressive filmmaker, right? Promising Young Woman was all about female rage and the patriarchy.
Yes.
Saltburn was about, well, whatever Saltburn was about.
Class envy, mostly.
Right. But the source claims that this Wuthering Heights accidentally reinforces deeply conservative, almost right-wing ideas. How does that work?
It's a really fascinating breakdown. So the argument goes like this. In the original book, the terrible behavior of the characters is heavily contextualized by the systems they are forced to live in. Extreme poverty, the strict British class hierarchy, outright racism.
And some reasons they are so damaged.
Exactly.
Right.
But because the movie strips all of that historical and social context away, because Heathcliff is just a handsome white gym bro and the poverty is just treated as a cool, gritty aesthetic choice, the characters are no longer victims of a system. They are just bad people.
Oh, I see. So the film accidentally portrays poor people as just scheming deviants by...
Exactly. It inadvertently implies that the lower classes are just inherently violent and toxic, rather than being the products of severe systemic abuse. It removes the sociology and just leaves the sociop.
And the source notes that this interpretation actually pissed off the communists.
Oh, yes. The movie is honestly a unique cultural achievement in that regard. It managed to anger the traditional literary purists, the regular moviegoers, and the actual communists.
That takes effort.
It really does. The source notes that left-wing critics were absolutely furious because the film entirely ignores the class struggle elements of the original book in favor of what they call capitalist nihilism.
Capitalist nihilism, just pretty people being mean in nice clothes.
Exactly. It's just attractive people in expensive costumes being incredibly cruel to each other for no structural reason. It's basically an advert for toxicity rather than any sort of critique of it.
So we have a movie that fails as a faithful adaptation, It fails as any kind of coherent political statement, and it seemingly succeeds only as a weird, moist mood board.
Pretty much.
But despite all of that, people are still going to see it. And the specific way they are watching it in the theaters is the next major battleground in this civil war we're discussing.
Wow.
This brings us to the literacy crisis.
Yes, this is where the source material really shifts gears from simple film criticism into heavy sociology, and it paints a very, very bleak picture of the general public.
The descriptions of the theater etiquette in these reviews, wild. We're not just talking about someone quietly checking their back row. We're talking about adult audiences giggling and shrieking and hooting at various adult.
It sounds like an absolute zoo.
Yeah.
The source describes these people as book talk, which are basically people who treat the public cinema exactly like their private living room.
Right.
Just talking at full volume to the screen, reacting loudly to every single thing. And then there's that specific detail mentioned about people literally ripping seats off the floor in the theater.
Yeah, I have to assume that's some level of hyperbole from the reviewer, or at least a very isolated, bizarre incident.
One would hope.
But even if it's a massive exaggeration, it points to a level of frenzy and chaos that just isn't normal for a dark drama.
Right, exactly. Why on earth are people screaming at Wuthering Heights? The source argues this behavior is a direct symptom of what it calls the death of literacy.
The death of literacy.
Yes. The underlying claim is that modern audiences, and they specifically target the young millennial and Gen Z demographic here, have completely lost the cognitive ability to abstract.
What exactly do they mean by the ability to abstract in this context?
It means they literally cannot watch a story set in the past and understand it on its own historical terms. They cannot view history as a separate country with different rules.
Oh, I see.
They have to view absolutely everything through the extremely narrow lens of their own modern 2026 life.
So if Heathcliff does something that is considered toxic by our modern standards, they can't take a step back and say, that is a tragic flaw of a damaged character.
Oh.
They just giggle nervously because the behavior is cringe.
Exactly that. They constantly impose modern morality and modern internet memes onto historical text. They desperately need the art to be, quote unquote, relatable to them personally.
Right.
And if it's not immediately relatable, they just reject it or mock it. The source argues this is exactly why the movie was dumbed down in the first, because the Hollywood filmmakers know for a fact that the modern audience simply cannot handle the moral complexity of the original Bronte text.
But there is a really powerful counter-argument provided in the source to the cynical idea that, well, people have just always been stupid and we're just noticing it now.
Yes.
And that is the story of the Fourpenny Professors. This part really stuck.
It is a totally crucial piece of historical context for their argument, because often when we criticize modern culture, people love to say, oh, people in the old days read trash petty dreadfuls too.
Right, it's the classic defense.
But the source actively pushes back on that by citing historical records about actual coal miners in the UK just prior to World War I.
Let's really set the scene here so you can pick. These are men working deep in the coal pit. It is incredibly dangerous, back-breaking physical labor.
Yes.
Most of them probably left school at, maybe 10 or 12 years old?
If that. Honest. They are physically exhausted every single day, breathing in toxic coal dust, living in extreme poverty.
Right.
By all modern logic, these are the exact people who should desperately want the 1910 equivalent of mindless slop. They should be the ones begging to just turn their brains off after a hard day.
But they didn't.
No, they absolutely didn't. They self-organized, they formed mutual libraries, they literally pooled their meager pennies together, which is where the term four-penny professors comes from, to buy expensive, heavy books.
And not just simple adventure books either.
No. They were reading John Ruskin, they were reading Thomas Carlyle, they were reading Thomas Hardy.
And Ruskin is definitely not light reading. That is incredibly dense Victorian social.
It is incredibly difficult, challenging text. It requires highly active, aggressive mental engagement to even parse the sentence. But these impoverished miners viewed education as a weapon.
A weapon.
Yes, they viewed it as a ladder out of the pit. They actively wanted to understand the complex world so they could change their place in it.
So the stark contrast the source is drawing here is pretty brutal. A starving coal miner with literally zero formal education in 1910 could read and digest highly complex Victorian philosophy.
Right.
But a college-educated middle-class moviegoer in 2026 apparently can't even sit through a movie adaptation of Wuthering Heights without screaming at the screen like a toddler.
That is exactly the damning conclusion the source is drawing. And it attributes this massive cultural shift to something it calls the feminization of education.
Now, we need to be extremely careful unpacking this term because, frankly, it sounds like a weird gender war talking point at first glance, but the source is actually using it impartially in a very specific academic sense, right?
Yes, we have to be clear here. It is not an argument that women are somehow ruining the school system.
Right.
It is an argument about a fundamental shift in pedagogy. the actual method of how we teach children. The source argues that classical education used to be heavily based on objective observation, memorizing facts, rote learning, and rigorous structural logic.
Okay.
And historically, within the academic framework, those were coded as masculine traits in the old educational system. You learned the specific date, you learned the underlying logic, you learned what the text actually said.
And what was the shift then?
The shift over the last few decades has been heavily toward empathy, relatability, and validating personal feeling.
Right.
The primary question asked in the classroom fundamentally changed. It went from, what did the author objectively mean when they wrote this, to, how does this text make you personally feel?
Ah, I see. So we essentially trained an entire generation to prioritize their own internal emotional reaction over the objective historical reality of the art itself.
Correct. And the source argues that if your primary metric for evaluating anything is just, how does this make me feel that right, then logically, anything that makes you feel uncomfortable or bored or confused is automatically categorized as bad art.
Because the feeling is bad.
Exactly. You don't try to understand the historical context of the discomfort. You just judge the art as flawed based entirely on your negative feelings. Hence, you get the smooth brain approach to media.
Right.
If the movie feels good, if it's hot and sexy and fast, then it's a good movie. If it feels challenging or slow or historically alien, then it's a bad movie.
Which perfectly explains why that middle ground we talked about earlier has completely vanished from the... You really can't have a nuanced, objective debate about raw. You either feel the vibe or you don't.
It entirely destroys critical distance.
Yeah.
You, the viewer, become the absolute center of the universe, and the art only exists to service and validate your immediate emotion.
But... And there's always a massive... But when we talk about Hollywood, this entire strategy of dumbing things down actually works financially because this movie made a lot of money.
It did. The source has to acknowledge the cold box office reality. It had an $80 million global debut, and in the current highly fractured theatrical climate, it is an undeniable hit.
Especially despite the critical trashing it took. The source notes that IGN and IGN are usually pretty generous with their blockbuster review scores, gave it a 3 out of 10.
Yes.
They gave it a score literally worse than the Gollum video. And for you listening, if you know anything about how catastrophically bad the Gollum game was, yeah, that is a truly devastating insult to hurl at a piece of media.
Being ranked worse than Gollum is barely physically possible, yet here we are. But despite that terrible word of mouth from critics, the walk-up business at the theaters was incredibly strong. People actively went out and bought tickets to see it.
So who are these people? Who is actually buying these tickets and driving that $80 million?
The source identifies the key demographics driving the box office, primarily older women and what they term young millennials.
Okay.
And it notes a very specific split in why they are going. You have large groups of women going for a communal adult movie viewing experience, which is basically corporate speak for a girls' night out to see the spicy, buzzy movie.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you have the actual literary fans who went on opening weekend desperately hoping for a faithful Bronte adaptation and then promptly left the theater completely angry.
The source uses a metaphor here to describe the appeal of the movie that is, well, it's genuinely pretty mean, but it undeniably paints a very clear picture of their art. The Kinder Surprise.
Yes, the toy in the Kinder Surprise analogy.
Yeah.
It is a incredibly brutal comparison. The Force argues that the movie appeals solely to lizard brain pleasure.
Right.
It explicitly compares the film to those tiny, cheap plastic toys you get inside Kinder Egg, and it specifically references the historical fact that those toys were legally banned in the U.S. for a long time because they were considered a dangerous choking hazard.
A choking hazard for small children who don't know any better.
Exactly. Or as the source heavily implies, a choking hazard for adults of, quote, lower intelligence.
Wow.
The underlying implication is that this movie is basically a shiny, colorful, cheap plastic choking hat. It is a mindless toy specifically manufactured for people who simply cannot be trusted to consume real dangerous art.
That is just incredibly unapologetically.
Oh, it is fiercely.
Yeah.
But that is the entire philosophical stance of Can't Be. They genuinely believe that by actively catering to the Kinder Surprise audience, Hollywood is doing measurable harm to our shared culture.
But we should point out that not absolutely everyone in the mainstream of trash. We definitely have to mention Grace Randall here.
Right.
Because she's a huge voice in the movie review space. She has millions of followers on, and she absolutely loved it.
She did. She was very positive. She actually compared its overall quality and vibe directly to the Barbie movie.
Now, for most normal people, comparing a new movie to Barbie, which was a beloved billion-dollar cultural phenomenon, would be seen as a massive compliment.
Yes.
But the source material does not see it that way at all.
No, not even slightly. The source completely hates the Barbie movie. It literally compares the experience of watching Barbie to having the flu.
Having the flu.
Yeah. So when a popular critic like Grace Randolph says, hey, this Wuthering Heights is as good as Barbie, the source essentially hears her saying, hey, This is as bad as having a terrible viral infection.
It just fully confirms their bias that the mainstream critics have entirely lost their mind.
Exactly. It validates their feeling that the cultural arbiters are broken.
And speaking of established mainstream institutions, we have to talk about you would naturally think the British Broadcasting Corporation would be the ultimate staunch defenders of Emily Bronte. She's a literal national treasure.
You would think so.
But the BBC Review called the film a, quote, bold reinvention and swoonily romantic.
Swoonily romantic. That specific phrase alone just absolutely drove the source crazy.
I can imagine.
But what's interesting is how the source dismisses the BBC's positive opinion. They don't just argue with the review itself, they attempt to invalidate the BBC's credibility entirely.
Right there is that anecdote mentioned about the controversial statue.
Yes, the statue outside the BBC office.
We probably don't need to get into the really gritty, horrible details of the statue sculptor here, but the basic gist for you listening is that it represents a figure strongly associated with, let's just say, very severely immoral criminal behavior.
Yes, and the source uses the continued presence of that specific statue to make a broader philosophical. They are basically saying, look at what this institution proudly displays outside their own headquarters.
Right.
Why on earth would you ever trust their critical judgment on what constitutes true romance or morality or artistic value?
It's an ad hominem attack on the institution.
Completely. It's a deliberate way of invalidating the entire organization. The argument is that if the BBC has so clearly lost its institutional moral compass, then its supposedly expert review of Wuthering Heights is completely worthless to it.
So we have a really fractured situation here. We have the internet critics who absolutely hate it. We have the general people, or a very specific demographic of people buying $80 million worth of it. And we have the legacy institutions like the highly praised.
Exactly.
Which naturally leads us to the final overarching argument of the source material. And this is by far the most deeply philosophical part, their argument about hierarchy.
Yes, this really gets to the absolute core of the entire can't-be worldview. The source makes a sweeping argument that the modern pursuit of equality has fundamentally destroyed the concept of quality.
Equality has destroyed quality. That sounds like a political campaign, but what does it actually mean in practice when we look?
It means that in order to produce or even appreciate truly great art, you must inherently believe that some things are just objectively better than others.
Okay.
You must fundamentally believe in a rigid hierarchy of value, meaning Shakespeare is objectively superior to a random tweet. Beethoven is objectively better than a catchy ringtone, and a faithful, complex adaptation of Bronte is objectively better than a vibes-based TikTok.
But we currently live in a dominant internet culture that constantly says, let people in, or don't yuck my yum. The idea that all art is entirely subjective.
And the source forcefully argues that specific attitude is the literal death of high culture. If you constantly say, don't judge you, you're implicitly saying that nothing actually matters. Because if every single interpretation is equally valid, then nothing can ever be accepted. If Wuthering Heights can be aggressively turned into a sexy, moist, smooth-brained romp, and our cultural response is just to say slake, then we've effectively destroyed the intellectual property entirely.
We have denied its inherent value as a difficult math.
Exactly, we've flattened.
There is a production theory mentioned here in the notes called writing for the bottom rung that ties right into this.
Yes, it's a fascinating look at modern media production. The core idea is that if you intentionally target your content at the lowest possible common denominator, what they call the bottom rung of intelligence or attention span, you might successfully capture a really big audience.
Because it's easy to...
Right. But everyone who sits on a rung above that bottom level will absolutely hate it.
They will feel actively insulted by...
Precisely.
Oh.
Because you are constantly over-explaining things they already naturally understand, or you're just flashing bright, colorful lights in their face instead of trusting their intelligence.
And this seems to be the crucial part of the theory if you write for the top rung. If you deliberately make highly complex, demanding high art, even the people sitting on the bottom rung can potentially appreciate it.
Like the coal miners we talked about.
Exactly like the four-penny professor. The coal miners certainly weren't the top rung of British society in terms of formal education or wealth by any means, but they could still read and deeply appreciate top-rung literature.
Exactly.
Because it actively gave them something greater to aspire to. It lifted them up mentally.
And the source argues that when modern Hollywood writes specifically for the bottom rung, when they purposefully make these smooth-brain vibe movies, they are actively dragging everyone else down into the intellectual mud with them.
They are denying people the basic chance to be challenged and become better.
Yeah.
So what is the actual solution here? Because the source doesn't just sit back and complain about the mud. It actually offers offers a very specific controversial strategy moving forward, and that strategy is aggressive.
It is a highly controversial take, but yes, the source firmly calls for a cultural return to unapologetic gatekeeping. It explicitly suggests that the people who genuinely enjoy this kind of slop should not be allowed anywhere near serious IP.
Basically saying, stay away from my Bronte, go watch.
Essentially, yeah. The core argument is that we urgently need to stop trying to make every single piece of media accessible to everyone. We actively need to protect our classic literature and history from the smooth brain interpretation.
And since Hollywood clearly isn't ever going to do that because Hollywood ultimately just wants that $80 million opening weekend, the source proposes the creation of a parallel.
This is the ultimate build-your-own-sandbox solution. The source argues that the current crop of mainstream Hollywood creatives are just physically incapable of making good art anymore because their brains are too heavily infected by this feelings over facts ideology.
Right.
They argue Fennell and others physically cannot make a faithful Wuthering Heights because they fundamentally no longer understand the rigorous worldview that originally created.
So the most based people, and that is the exact term the source uses, need to start opening their own.
That is the long-term idea, to create a completely separate production space, something exclusive, something intentionally exceptional and prestigious, a cultural place where the concept of equality is checked at the door and objective quality is the only metric that matters.
A place that utterly refuses to pander to the lowest denominator.
Exactly.
It honestly sounds a bit like Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, but just for movie buffs. Like, we are taking our elite talent and we are going to Galt's Gulch to make period dramas.
There's definitely a very strong flavor of that libertarian separation. It's a massive reactionary swing against the perceived overwhelming mediocrity of the current mainstream.
There was one final visual analogy the source used near the end that I thought was just perfect to wrap up their whole aesthetic argument. The Starfleet Academy comparison.
Oh, yeah. This was a really sharp dig at modern costume and production design.
Yeah.
The source directly compared the ugly minge braids and the incredibly weird anachronistic costuming in this movie to the design choices in modern Star Trek ships.
Specifically referencing Star Trek Discovery, right?
Yes. The argument there is that modern Hollywood designers seem to actively go out of their way to make things look slightly off or highly asymmetrical or just plain ugly simply for the sake of being visually different from the past.
Or worse, that they just genuinely lack the artistic taste to know the difference between what is actually edgy and what is just bad.
Right. The source implies it's a massive underlying competence crisis.
Yeah.
We have collectively forgotten how to create real beauty because we have spent a decade actively deconstructing the very idea of beauty itself.
Wow.
We just blindly accept the ugly now because the critics tell us it is modern and transgressive.
So let's try to summarize the current state of this battlefield we've been walking through. On one side, you have the moist faction.
Right.
They are smooth-brained, they are entirely vibe-based, they are happily enjoying the sensory overload, and potentially ripping theater seats off the floor in sheer excitement.
The Kinder Surprise audience.
Oh, exactly. And then on the other side, you have the gatekeepers. They are furious. They are loudly mourning the absolute death of media literacy. They are clutching their worn copies of John Ruskin, and they are demanding a completely separate parallel film economy.
Right in the middle between those two screaming factions.
Nothing.
Nothing. Just a massive cultural vacuum where a nuanced conversation used to be.
It really leaves you with a serious provocation to think about. The source is ultimately asking us to make a choice. And not just deciding which movie ticket to buy this weekend, but deciding which fundamental worldview we actually want to subscribe to.
It raises the ultimate cultural question. Is the constant democratization of media actually just a rapid race to the bottom?
Right.
When we loudly declare that art is for everyone, do we eventually ensure through pandering that the art is actually for no one?
Or at least that the art simply becomes nothing more significant than a shiny plastic toy inside a Kinder Egg.
Exactly. If we entirely stop judging art as objectively good or bad, just to avoid looking elitist at dinner parties, do we eventually lose the capacity to create anything lasting or meaningful at all?
Yeah.
That is the truly haunting question the source leaves us grappling with.
Because it really asks, is it better to be an incredibly unhappy gatekeeper with extremely high, or is it better to just be a happy, smooth brain watching a sexy goose on screen?
That is honestly the defining question of our time.
I mean, I think I know which side the source material is very clearly on, but as for you listening to this right now, that's a choice side on your own. We're really just here to unpack the mechanics.
Indeed we are.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sludge, the slime, and the heavy sociology of Wuthering Heights. We will see you all next time.